how to keep required humidity and how to give water to tarantulas, especially small slings, is one of the big questions that most beginners have and don't really understand, so this video should help. When it comes to humidity, you will often see in online care sheets that precise humidity percentage is required for different species, and often that causes confusion for beginners, because how can you maintain, for example, I don't know, 70% humidity in this enclosure? How do you know that there is 70% humidity? How do you know that this is 60% humidity? Because of the way that care sheets are written, it seems like you need to hold that exact percentage, otherwise it will be a disaster for a tarantula, but that is really far from the truth. I will show you the way I keep my enclosures humid and the way I give water to my slings and bigger tarantulas. So that is the way I do it. Perhaps someone else does it the other way. It is really hard to tell what is the best way to do it. And I'm not telling that my way is the right way and the best way. Since I have very little deaths in my collection, I will assume that it is a decent way to do it. When it comes to keeping humidity, general information that you need is if that species requires a humid environment or dry environment. That is basically how I separate all of my enclosures. For majority of beginner species, keeping humidity is really easy. You just have a water dish and make sure that it's constantly filled. And like every once a month, you want to moist one part of the enclosure, usually one corner of enclosure. I will show you later how to do that. So that is basic care for majority of beginner species. Some species require bone dry substrate, like for example green bottle blue, the Chromatopelma cyaneopubescens. For them, all you need is water dish, full water dish, and they'll be fine. Note that we are talking about adults, not slings. Then you have species that require more humid environment, like for example Petzloterias or Hylobrachys species. For them I also keep a full water dish, but every week I moist the substrate. That is also the reason why in my Petzloteria enclosure you see alive plants, because simply by watering them and maintaining them you are keeping the required humidity inside. And then you have species that require really humid environment, like Terraphosa species, for example, Styrmi, Blondie and Apophysis, I don't know. They require moist substrate all the time. But Petzloterias and Terraphosas are more advanced species, so by the time you are experienced enough to keep those species, you will also be experienced enough with maintaining appropriate humidity in your enclosures. So maintaining that humidity is really not an issue for experienced keeper. For slings, you notice that I don't have a water dish inside of my enclosures, like in these CD enclosures or in these enclosures. I don't have a water dish. The truth is, in nature, basically, tarantulas don't have a water dish. And moisture they mainly get from environment and from their prey. But in captivity, if you can, you want to keep a water dish, because that is actually just a precaution to make sure that tarantula have a place to drink if it requires. And yes, tarantulas will drink from water dish. In fact, I've seen my Petzloteria ornata going out of her corkbark tube all the way down there, exactly where her water dish is, to drink it. Maybe it was pure coincidence, or maybe she actually knew that there is a water source there. I don't know. I don't speak spider. So back to the slings. All slings I keep on a bit of more moist substrate than you would keep their adult counterparts, because they don't have a water dish, but then they will have higher humidity in their environment, and they also can drink from the substrate if it's wet enough. Let me show you a few examples. In majority of my sling enclosures I have cocoa fiber, and just by looking at the cocoa fiber you can see how much humidity there is in the enclosure. You can see just by looking at the substrate that it is a bit dry, and this enclosure, just by comparing these two, you can see that it is more humid. So with more experience you will get the feel for it, and just by looking at the enclosure you will see if it needs more water or not. Now this Psalmopeos enclosure it is a bit too dry, and you generally don't want your enclosure to look like this for majority of things. And this is other Psalmopeus enclosure. If you look at it closely, you can see that it has a bit more moisture, but since today is the day when I'm supposed to water my enclosures, it requires more humidity. So I will show you how I moist the substrate. You see, I have this syringe. I fill it with water. It is not tap water, I use purified water. And through the hole I add humidity, I mean water. Yeah, like that. This light is really not good. So you can see now how this substrate is wet. But of course you don't want it to get too wet. You want to make sure that substrate can pull all the water that you add to your enclosure. You don't want it float on the top of the substrate. I water my enclosures once a week, and the basic rule of thumb of how much water it requires greatly depends on the ventilation you have on the enclosure. So it depends on the amount of holes you have on your lid, on your sides. So not every enclosure is the same. I can't really just tell you add 5 milliliters of water, because that's not how it works. With time you will get the general feel. So you see, just through the hole but what you want is that next week when you come to water your enclosure again, substrate should almost dry out. Not completely dry out, but almost dry out. That's the general rule that I use. And you see, the reason why I use syringe is because I don't need to open enclosures to add water. That is really convenient when you have more enclosures. Like, for example, these Lampropelma violaceopes enclosures. I have these holes and I just add water. And the same rule goes for bigger enclosures. The only difference is you don't need to keep the whole substrate moist. You just want to keep one corner of enclosure. But again, not too moist. Don't get it too soggy and all. Now regarding the Avicularia species. Those are the species that, from what I see, majority of beginners have problems. As you know, this is no longer Avicularia, it's now Caribena versicolor, but still it's almost the same tarantula. Again, one part of substrate moist, like this. You see? Just one part, not the entire enclosure. And then you want to leave few drops of water on its web. Close that off before it goes outside. The main thing that kills Avicularias, it is the fact that people think that they need a lot of humidity. They need humidity, but I keep this one as all my other tarantulas, and it is fine, as you can see, it's not dead. So what I think, and majority of more experienced people think, that the main reason that kills Avicularias is a soggy enclosure. Too humid with not enough ventilation. Here I have three terrestrial, so you just pick one corner and there. Keeping the right humidity is not really complicated. You don't need humidity gauges or anything like that. This is the Brachypelma vagans, or Emilia? No. Oh yeah, this is Emilia. And you see, substrate is a bit moist, so it does not require much water, just like, and that's enough for this enclosure. It doesn't have great ventilation, so that is the reason why it stays more moist. Also, For this, just tiny drops. And the sling can easily drink from the substrate. Let me try and get a tarantula to drink. You see how it's drinking? It is sucking it from the substrate. Even without the water dish, it can still drink. This is the Hylobrachys Vietnam blue enclosure. I fill it up once a week and I moist the substrate. This is my basic measurement for my enclosures. Brachypelma albopilosum. So I would fill the water dish and approximately once a month I would moist one corner of the enclosure. This is like the most basic care for all beginner species. So you do that like once a month and make sure that it dries out. Now for Poecilotherias, you see live plants. Also water dish. That's how I keep the humidity in my enclosures. I didn't really wrote some script to make sure I don't miss something, so I hope that I said everything and that it was understandable. But just remember, water once a week, make sure that it gets dry but not dry out completely. And for adults, full water dish, moist the substrate once a month and make sure it dries out. And for the species that require more humidity, just moist the substrate more often. So I hope you enjoyed and learned something from this video. If you did, thumbs it up and comment something. And if you're new to this channel, make sure to subscribe. I upload every Monday and Friday, so see you again soon. Bye!